All right, so now that we have the basic setup for our full stack application in place, we've got scripts to run everything, we've got everything installed in the back end, and basically we've just got everything set up. The next step, of course, is to actually create different routes on our server that our front end can query. Now, essentially, what we're going to be replacing here is what we saw inside our context in our front end. Let me just open that up here. That was our notes context, which was provided by our notes provider. So basically, we're going to be replacing all of the logic that's in here with calls to our server. Now, the reason that we would want to do this in the first place is really the reason why we would want to build a full stack app in the first place, right? Basically, it allows the user to persist all of this data, right? Their notes, everything that they're writing, somewhere other than in their own browser on their own computer, right? So this has a variety of benefits, which I've discussed previously. One is that it allows the user to log into their account, which, we're going to take a look at logging in later on, but it would allow the user to log into their account on a different computer and see the same data. That's just something we've come to expect these days, of course, but, that's essentially what adding a backend to our application does. It allows us to have a centralized place where all of our users' data is persisted, and then what our front end has to do is just make a query to that backend to do things like load data, create data, update data, delete data, etc. So essentially what we're going to be doing here is replacing all of these things here, right? All of the places where we just have code that's replacing some kind of data in a state variable inside a React component. And we're going to be moving that kind of logic into our server and having our front end just make the right requests to the right server endpoints when these functions here, all right, like create note, update note, delete note, are called. Now, additionally, we're going to need to have some kind of logic in here for loading the data. And to do that, we're going to be using the use effect hook. We've seen what this looks like before, but if you don't quite remember what that looked like, this will be a good review for you here. So to get started here, what we're going to do is add our first endpoint to this server. And that's going to be an endpoint for loading all of the notes in our application. So let's create that endpoint. We're going to say app.get. This is going to be a get endpoint. This is something we talked about previously. Basically, all endpoints that we load initial data from are get endpoints. And the path for this is just going to be /notes, okay? Now, just as a side note here, when we end up transitioning our application, right, our note sharing application over to use user authentication, the path for this is going to have to change slightly. It's going to have to actually take into account the user who's making that request. So this might change to something like /users/user ID. Oops, user, okay, I just spelled that completely wrong. Let me try that again. User ID /notes, right? That might be what this endpoint path ends up looking like. But for now, since our application has only one user, which is us, the developer, we're just going to leave that as notes, and we can always, it's a fairly easy thing to change later on. So not a big deal there. Just wanted to point that out. Okay, and essentially what we're going to do inside of here is just return the notes in our server, and eventually we'll be storing those in a database, but for now, just to get the basic front-end, back-end communication built out, what we're going to do is copy and paste the fake notes from our notes provider into our server, and that's basically going to be what we end up modifying and returning, that kind of thing. So let's change this to, we'll change it from fake notes, we'll just say let notes db. We'll just call it DB because it's right now just a fake in-memory database. And what we'll do when the user wants to load those notes is just say response.json and send back our notes DB. In fact, I actually don't like that name. We're going to change this to just notes. We'll use notes DB when we actually add MongoDB to our server. Okay, so we're just sending back the notes to the front end, right? Whoever the client side is, we're sending those notes back. And we should see if we open up our console. Oops, actually, it looks like our server has run into an address in use thing. I've actually found that this happens sometimes when using Node daemon or just when using some kind of package that restarts your server automatically. I've found that it will sometimes run into this problem when it tries to restart too quickly, right? When you make a change, save in rapid succession, that can sometimes cause problems. So we're just going to restart this here with npm run start, or npm run dev, actually it was, inside our notes app directory. And that should start up our server and our front end, and our server should have this updated notes route here. Okay, so what we can do if we want to check this is we can just go to localhost 8080/notes in a browser, and what you'll see is that that sends back the data for our notes, okay? So now that we've created that on our back end, what we're gonna do is go to our front end and have our front end actually load that data. So we just need our front end to make the same request that we just made through our browser using a library like Axios or something like that. So in fact, I do actually want to use Axios in our front end. So I'm going to open up a terminal in the front end. We're going to say cd front end, and I'm going to say npm install, and we're going to install the Axios package. You can just use something called the fetch API if you want to. I'm not sure if you've seen any videos about that yet, but basically the fetch API is a built-in API in the browser that allows you to make network requests. The reason that I install Axios is because, frankly, it's just much easier to work with. So that's the main reasoning there. And now that we have Axios installed, we're going to open up our notes provider, and we want our notes provider to load our notes when the app is first opened up. Okay, so what we're going to do for that, we're going to import the use effect hook from React. And what we're going to do, first of all, we're going to delete these fake notes here. And we're going to set the initial state of our notes state variable here to an empty array. Okay? Now, if you want to add an isLoading variable to this as well, you can do that. We're just going to say isLoading and set isLoading. And this will make it possible for components that are relying on this data to actually see whether or not the data they're trying to access is available yet. So we're going to say use state, and that should actually be true since it's loading to begin with by default. And what we're going to do next is we're going to add that use effect hook that we just imported. We're going to say use effect, and inside here is where we're going to actually load the notes from our server. Okay? Now, I put this empty array thing here as a second argument to use effect because we only want this to load once when our application actually starts up, right? When our notes provider is first rendered. There are going to be situations where that won't be the case, where you'll actually want this to load data, on different pages that the user goes to, etc. But for now, this is just the easiest way to do it. So inside this use effect hook, we're going to do what you may have seen before if you watched the full stack introduction videos. And that's going to be, we're going to create a new asynchronous function here, which we'll call something like load notes. And that's going to be async, as I said. And essentially what it's going to do is use the Axios library to make a request to our server. Now, first of all, two things that we have to do. We're going to have to import Axios from Axios so that we'll actually be able to use that library to make that request. And the second thing we're going to have to do is set up a proxy between our front end and back end that will make it so that our front end and back end think they're running on the same origin. This will prevent things like CORS errors, that kind of stuff that we saw earlier. So let's open up our front end's package.json here, and all we need to do is add a proxy property and set the value of that to the path to our server, right? Where our server is currently running. Now that's going to be http://localhost 8080. And that should be all we need to do. So we will need to restart our front end because this can cause some very strange errors if you don't do it. And I've been burned a couple times by that and, spent a long time trying to troubleshoot an error that was just because I didn't restart my front end after doing that. So let's do that right now. In fact, it wasn't even running, so we should be good. I'm just going to run it again with npm run dev, and we should be good to go. So now that we have the proxy set up, what making a request to our backend is going to look like, we can basically just use the path, right? The path being, let's just take a look here. The path being this /notes thing, or whatever path we've specified for our endpoint. All right, so what that's going to look like, we're going to say const response equals await axios.get. We're making a get request here. And then the path is going to be /notes. Okay, and that should give us all of the notes back from our server. The next thing we're going to do is take the data that was included in that response, which should be an array of notes, and set our notes to that response, and set is loading to false. So we're going to say set notes response.data, and set is loading to false. All right, now in the case that that fails for some reason, we are going to want to wrap this in a try-catch block just to prevent our app from freaking out if that's the case. And inside the catch block, all we're going to do, for now anyway, is just say set is loading to false. Okay, so basically that will make the rest of our app work with no notes, right? It'll just pass an empty array, and all of our components in our application should work just fine when they have an empty array instead of an actual array of notes. All right, so let's just call load notes now inside our useEffect hook, and that should take care of loading the notes for our application. So our app is running. Let's just take a look and see if this actually works. What I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to log out our notes. We're going to say console.log, and I'm just going to log out response.data just to show that everything is working correctly inside this useEffect hook. Okay, so let's go back to here. I'm going to open up the console here, go to console and refresh the page, and we should see that this array is logged out and that it contains my first note and hello my dear friends as the content, and that's basically data that we're getting back from the server. Okay, now you may have noticed if we refresh this page, we're on the note detail page right now. If we refresh this page, you'll see that the note not found page flashes briefly. And that's because we're not taking into account yet that the notes array could be empty if our data is still loading from the server. So what we're going to do is pass this is loading thing to our value down here. We're going to say notes and is loading. And that will make it available to components that are using the notes context, and it will allow them to display different things depending on whether or not our notes are loading, right? In other words, for our note detail page, which we'll just open that up here, it will make it so that we can display some kind of loading message if we haven't actually loaded the note yet, instead of displaying the note not found page initially, which is a little bit unnerving for users, to put it lightly. So what we're going to do is up here, we're going to get access to the is loading variable, which is now being provided from our notes context provider. And all we're going to do is check and see if we're currently loading. In that case, we're just going to display a spinner or something. I'm just going to display a loading message inside a paragraph tag like that. Okay, so now if we go back and refresh it, we'll just see a nice little loading message flash very briefly before we get data back from the server. Now, one last thing I want to mention here with our notes provider is that there may well be situations where we don't want to load the note data when the app is first loaded, right? Now, situations like that would be if the user goes to a page that doesn't actually require this data. It's possible that we could be wasting bandwidth by, loading notes when it's not clear that the user is actually going to need them. So the main reason that we are doing this right here and loading the notes when the app first starts up is because most of the functionality in our application right now depends on those notes. So in other words, there's no page that the user can go to besides like the not found page that won't need this data. So just to make everything easier, we're loading it when the app first starts up. But again, the point here is that that won't always be the case. So we've added data loading capabilities to our front end, and we've added a corresponding endpoint in our back end to send that data back to our front end. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.